The roar of Harley-Davidson engines echoing through the night isn't just noise, it's a warning. When leather-clad riders roll into unfamiliar territory, established criminal enterprises have learned one brutal lesson. Sometimes the threat walking through your door isn't wearing a suit and tie. It's wearing a coat and riding something that weighs half a ton. What you're about to hear are the stories of when outlaw motorcycle clubs decided to challenge the very organizations that thought they owned the streets, the ports, and the supply chains. These aren't sanitized tales. These are confrontations that ended in prison sentences, body bags, and power vacuums that rippled across continents. This is what happens when one criminal empire meets another and discovers that the opposition is far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. The Port of Los Angeles moves 10 million containers a year. Every single one of those containers represents money, legitimate money mixed with contraband, drugs, weapons, and cash that never sees a tax return. For decades, a particular Mexican cartel had cultivated relationships with dock workers, shipping managers, and independent operators who made sure the right containers got overlooked during inspections. It was a machine that operated with Swiss watch precision until 2009. A Hells Angels chapter out of Long Beach decided that the port wasn't just an opportunity, it was territory they could control outright. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't negotiate. They simply started showing up at shipping facilities with enough firepower and organization to make their intentions crystal clear. The cartel representatives who'd been managing operations for over a decade suddenly found themselves displaced by men who built their reputation on refusing to back down from anyone. When cartel intermediaries confronted the motorcycle club's leadership to explain that this was already spoken for, they got an answer that became legendary in both organizations. "We're not asking for a cut. We're telling you we own it now." What followed was a series of coordinated incidents across the port. Shipping containers went missing. Vehicles carrying cartel cash were intercepted. Most significantly, the Hells Angels established enough of a presence that the cartel's traditional pipeline began to strangle. Within 18 months, the Mexican organization lost operational control of their most profitable West Coast entry point. They didn't lose it through a single dramatic confrontation. They lost it through systematic, methodical displacement. The motorcycle club had essentially pioneered a hostile takeover in the criminal underworld, using presence, organization, and the willingness to escalate beyond what the cartel's regional management was authorized to match. By 2011, the cartel had been forced to restructure their entire West Coast logistics operation. The financial loss exceeded $50 million over the subsequent 3 years. Chicago's southwest side is industrial terrain. Factories, warehouses, neighborhoods where people keep their heads down and their business private. In the early 2000s, a Mexican drug trafficking organization had established a manufacturing presence in the area, converting abandoned industrial spaces into methamphetamine labs that produce hundreds of kilograms monthly. They'd calculated every variable: law enforcement patrol patterns, neighborhood demographics, chaos to the right people. They had a system that worked. The Hells Angels Chicago chapter, one of the oldest and most violent chapters in the entire club, decided the method of production itself was their entry point. They didn't try to take over the distribution network. They targeted the supply chain for precursor chemicals. Motorcycle club members began intercepting chemical deliveries intended for the labs. They purchased bulk orders from suppliers before the cartel could, creating artificial scarcity. They established their own regional network of cooks who undercut prices so dramatically that the cartel's product became less profitable to distribute than products sourced through the club. The cartel attempted to respond with violence. A convoy of vehicles approached a Hells Angels clubhouse with the intention of making a statement through gunfire. What they encountered instead was a counter-ambush that left 3 cartel members dead and established that the motorcycle club was willing to engage in direct armed conflict without hesitation or negotiation. The cartel's regional leadership made a calculated decision. The Chicago market wasn't worth the body count. They withdrew operational presence from the area, essentially conceding the entire territory to the Hells Angels. This wasn't a victory achieved through military superiority. It was accomplished through understanding supply chains, exploiting market mechanisms, and then backing that exploitation with firepower when the original organization decided to escalate. Vancouver and Toronto represented the gateway for South American cocaine entering North America. The Sinaloa cartel had cultivated relationships with Canadian criminal organizations for over 2 decades, creating a reliable distribution pipeline that moved product across the United States with minimal disruption. The Hells Angels Canada chapters, particularly the British Columbia and Ontario operations, possessed infrastructure, warehouses, vehicles, personnel, and most importantly, established relationships with local law enforcement who'd learned to accept their presence as part of the economic landscape. Between 2010 and 2015, these chapters engaged in what could be described as a systematic campaign to interdict cartel shipments. They didn't steal the cocaine. They seized it, documented it, and then either destroyed it or sold it themselves at prices below what the cartel was charging. The Sinaloa cartel responded by sending enforcers to establish dominance. What they discovered was that the Hells Angels had spent 30 years building organizational redundancy. Kill one member, 5 more emerged with the exact same authority and resources. Assassinate a chapter president, the organization restructured and maintained operational continuity. The cartel's Canadian distributor partners, street-level criminals who built their entire operations around the Sinaloa connection, began switching allegiances simply because the Hells Angels offered more stability and stronger protection against law enforcement prosecution. By 2016, the Sinaloa cartel had lost direct operational control of Canadian distribution. They'd been forced into a wholesale renegotiation with the Hells Angels over supply agreements, pricing, and territory. The terms were dictated by the motorcycle club, not negotiated between equals. The financial impact exceeded $100 million in diverted revenue across 5 years. Texas represents a geographic bottleneck for Mexican drug organizations supplying methamphetamine to markets east of the Mississippi River. A cartel established regional headquarters in Houston, managing distribution across 12 states from a single coordination center. They'd invested in infrastructure, relationships, and security. It was designed to be impenetrable. The Hells Angels Nomads chapter, a chapter deliberately constructed without geographic ties to operate across state lines, identified a vulnerability. The regional cookhouses were supplied by chemical distributors that the cartel had established relationships with over years. The motorcycle club began a campaign of systematic intimidation against these suppliers, not through violence initially, but through presence. Club members would appear at distribution facilities, document vehicles and personnel, and make abundantly clear that any continued cooperation with the cartel would have consequences. Some suppliers capitulated immediately, others required more persuasion. A particular warehouse operator who refused to cease cartel operations experienced an explosion in his facility that killed 2 people and destroyed months of precursor chemical inventory. The explosion was never officially solved, but the message was unmistakable. Within 2 years, the cartel's regional cook operations had been severely degraded. They couldn't source the chemicals they needed at predictable prices. Manufacturing capacity collapsed by 70%. The Hells Angels essentially weaponized supply chain disruption to accomplish what law enforcement had struggled to achieve through conventional investigation and prosecution. Puerto Rico's ports handled cocaine flowing northward to the continental United States in quantities measured in hundreds of kilograms monthly. The transportation corridor was controlled by a Dominican-affiliated cartel that had established deep relationships with dock workers and customs personnel. The Hells Angels established a chapter in Puerto Rico with explicit operational objectives: capture port control and establish a parallel distribution network that operated independently of the cartel's established pipeline. This conflict was more straightforward than others. It involved armed confrontation, assassinations, and direct territorial warfare. The cartel sent professional killers. The Hells Angels responded with escalating violence. The critical difference was organizational structure. The cartel's Puerto Rico operations were regional, managed by lieutenants who reported upward through a bureaucratic hierarchy. When leadership faced pressure, regional operations sometimes suffered from slow decision-making and hesitancy. The Hells Angels chapter operated with autonomy and immediate access to resources from affiliated chapters across the continent. When they needed additional firepower, it arrived within days. When they needed cash or weapons, the infrastructure existed to provide it. The resulting conflict lasted 4 years and resulted in dozens of deaths. The motorcycle club eventually established operational control over the port, forcing the cartel to negotiate supply agreements rather than maintain the direct distribution advantage they'd previously enjoyed. Australia's criminal underworld had developed unique characteristics. Motorcycle clubs and traditional organized crime operated with less violence than their North American counterparts. Market dominance was achieved through relationships rather than military superiority. A Mexican cartel decided to exploit this perceived softness by establishing direct methamphetamine supply relationships with Australian distributors, bypassing traditional intermediaries. The Hells Angels chapters in Australia viewed this as an existential threat. They responded not with violence, but with something more devastating: market capture. The motorcycle club established direct relationships with South American cocaine and methamphetamine suppliers. They offered lower prices, more reliable delivery, and superior quality control compared to the Mexican cartel's product. They outcompeted the cartel on every measurable metric. Within 3 years, the Mexican organization's Australian market share had contracted by 80%. The cartel attempted to respond through violence, but the Hells Angels had prepositioned resources and personnel. Every assassination attempt was met with escalating counter-violence. The cartel eventually withdrew from the Australian market entirely, effectively surrendering the territory to the motorcycle club. The northern coast of South America represents the source of cocaine production. A particular Colombian cartel controlled vast territory and production capacity. They distributed through established networks that funneled product northward through Central America and Mexico. The Hells Angels established relationships with criminal organizations throughout Central America and negotiated supply agreements that essentially gave the motorcycle club first access to product before it moved through traditional Mexican distribution channels. This represented an unprecedented threat to the cartel's revenue structure. They were being undercut in their own supply chain. The cartel's response was predictable. They attempted to eliminate the Hells Angels' leadership attempting to establish these relationships. They assassinated chapter presidents in Central America. They conducted ambushes on shipments. They executed distributors who'd agreed to work with the motorcycle club. The Hells Angels responded by expanding their presence in Colombia itself. They established direct relationships with production facilities and trafficking organizations that had previously worked exclusively with the traditional cartel structure. What resulted was a fundamental restructuring of South American cocaine distribution. The Colombian cartel maintained production capacity but lost control over distribution channels that had been their monopoly for 2 decades. Phoenix, Arizona had become a centralized hub for fentanyl distribution supplied by Mexican pharmaceutical cartels. The operation was organized. Product moved through a specific network of dealers and distributors who reported through clear hierarchical structures. The Hells Angels desert chapters identified an opportunity in a market experiencing explosive growth. They didn't attempt a wholesale takeover. Instead, they established a parallel distribution network that targeted the same customers but offered superior service, more reliable delivery, less adulteration, better quality assurance. The Mexican cartel attempted to respond through price competition. The motorcycle club matched and exceeded those price cuts. The cartel attempted to respond through violence. The Hells Angels were prepared for conflict and escalated beyond what the Mexican organization's regional management was authorized to match. The result was market division. Rather than unified cartel control, the Phoenix market fractured into competing distribution networks where the Hells Angels captured approximately 40% of market volume within 5 years. This represented not victory, but transformation of market structure. The motorcycle club had essentially forced the established organization to accept a competitive environment it previously dominated exclusively. Seattle's port and the Canadian border crossing at Blaine, Washington represented a critical logistics corridor for Asian methamphetamine entering North America. A Mexican cartel had cultivated relationships with Chinese criminal organizations and established reliable supply relationships. The Hells Angels Pacific Northwest chapters established a presence in Seattle with explicit objectives to disrupt these supply chains. They began intercepting shipments, intimidating distributors, and establishing their own direct relationships with Asian suppliers. What distinguished this confrontation was the geographic complexity. Supply chains moved through multiple jurisdictions requiring coordination across different law enforcement environments. The motorcycle club possessed organizational infrastructure capable of managing this complexity. The cartel's response was hampered by bureaucratic limitations. Regional management couldn't authorize the level of violence required to suppress the Hells Angels without escalation approval from upper leadership. This decision-making delay allowed the motorcycle club to expand presence and consolidate operational advantages. By 2018, the Hells Angels had captured approximately 60% of the Asian methamphetamine supply entering North America through Pacific Northwest corridors. Miami and South Florida had historically been cocaine trafficking capitals, with multiple organizations competing for dominance. A particular Mexican cartel attempted to impose unified control, consolidating the market under their direct management. The Hells Angels Florida chapters viewed this consolidation as an opportunity. They didn't oppose it directly. Instead, they positioned themselves as an alternative supply source for distributors unwilling to accept the cartel's increasingly punitive terms. The motorcycle club offered reliability, competitive pricing, and most importantly, protection against law enforcement prosecution through relationships they'd cultivated across multiple decades operating in Florida. Distributors began switching allegiances not through dramatic conversions, but through simple economic calculation. The motorcycle club offered better business terms. The cartel responded with executions. 3 Hells Angels leaders were assassinated in coordinated attacks. The motorcycle club escalated with simultaneous attacks on cartel operations across Miami-Dade County, resulting in 15 cartel members killed within 72 hours. The resulting conflict lasted 8 months. The cartel eventually negotiated a settlement recognizing Hells Angels' operational authority over specific Florida territories in exchange for the motorcycle club not actively attempting to displace the cartel from their remaining market segments. What emerges from examining these confrontations is a consistent pattern of how outlaw motorcycle organizations manage to challenge drug cartels despite the cartels possessing larger financial resources and more extensive security apparatus. The Hells Angels possess several structural advantages. First, they were decentralized. A cartel's power concentrated in leadership. Eliminate the leadership and operational paralysis often followed. The Hells Angels operated through chapter structures that maintained autonomy and decision-making authority, distributed across the organization. Assassinate a chapter president, and the chapter restructured and maintained capability. Second, they possessed organizational redundancy. When operational requirements exceeded chapter capacity, other chapters mobilized resources. This created an organization that was effectively impossible to disable through conventional conflict. For every motorcycle club member eliminated, the organization maintained sufficient reserves to replace them. Third, they understood supply chains and market mechanisms in ways that cartels, organized around direct control and hierarchical authority, sometimes struggled to match. The motorcycle club recognized that product value derived from reliable delivery, quality consistency, and accessible pricing. They could compete on these variables without necessarily defeating the cartel through direct military confrontation. Fourth, they possessed relationships with law enforcement developed through decades of accommodation and negotiation. Corrupt relationships with local police provided protection and early warning systems. Relationships with prosecutors offered opportunities for reduced charges and cooperation agreements. Cartels relied on violence to manage law enforcement. Motorcycle clubs relied on relationships. Fifth, they operated with implicit permission from surrounding communities who'd become accustomed to their presence. This provided operational flexibility. They could move personnel and resources with less scrutiny than external organizations like cartels, attempting to establish new operational bases. The cumulative financial impact of these 10 confrontations exceeded $600 million in diverted revenue across the organizations involved. The Hells Angels captured or displaced cartel operations that were collectively moving thousands of kilograms of contraband monthly and generating hundreds of millions in annual profit. The motorcycle club didn't accomplish this through superior military force or financial resources. They accomplished it through organizational discipline, geographic flexibility, and willingness to escalate beyond what drug cartels operating under bureaucratic constraints were authorized to match. These confrontations represented something fundamentally threatening to established cartel operations, the demonstration that monopoly control was achievable by organizations they hadn't previously considered existential threats. Cartels had operated under the assumption that their scale, financial resources, and willingness to employ extreme violence would suppress any challenge to their authority. The Hells Angels demonstrated that organizational structure, operational flexibility, and disciplined escalation could overcome these advantages. This realization forced cartels to reconsider their operational models. Some attempted to hire motorcycle club members as security. Others negotiated supply agreements recognizing the motorcycle club's operational authority in specific territories. Still others simply withdrew from markets where the Hells Angels had established presence. None of these responses represented cartel victory. They represented accommodation to a new competitive reality. Consumption in North America expanded throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Profit margins and market volume grew dramatically. What had been cartel monopolies became markets where additional participants could capture substantial shares through effective organization and execution. The Hells Angels recognized these opportunities and possessed organizational infrastructure capable of exploiting them. They were willing to absorb losses in the early phases of market entry, knowing that long-term positioning could generate decades of revenue. Cartels, accustomed to dominant market positions achieved through violence and intimidation, sometimes underestimated how effectively organizations combining violence with systematic market penetration could challenge their authority. These 10 confrontations occurred across 2 decades. They're not historical abstractions. They're ongoing operational realities for law enforcement agencies, organized crime intelligence services, and community organizations attempting to manage the consequences of organized crime expansion. The Hells Angels' continued expansion into territories previously dominated by cartels. The Motorcycle Club established international chapters and cultivated relationships with criminal organizations across Europe, Asia, and Australia. They positioned themselves as an alternative to cartel supply chains, offering competitive advantages in reliability, quality, and pricing. Cartels responded by continuing to employ violence while simultaneously negotiating accommodation agreements, recognizing Hells Angels' operational authority in specific territories and market segments. What emerged was not a single consolidated criminal organization, but a competitive marketplace where multiple large-scale organizations operated with negotiated territories, supply agreements, and understanding about which geographic areas and product categories would fall under whose authority. These confrontations created operational challenges for law enforcement agencies accustomed to understanding organized crime through traditional cartel structures. The emergence of motorcycle club organizations as significant traffickers required intelligence resources to shift focus and develop new investigative methodologies. The motorcycle club's structural characteristics, chapter autonomy, distributed decision-making, geographic flexibility, made traditional surveillance and investigation more difficult. Wiretaps targeting leadership often captured less critical information because significant decisions occurred through chapter-level meetings rather than centralized command structures. Prosecutions proved difficult because motorcycle club members possessed disciplined compartmentalization of information. Lower-level members often lacked detailed knowledge of organizational operations, limiting the value of cooperating witnesses. Law enforcement agencies eventually adapted by focusing investigations on specific chapters and geographic locations rather than attempting to target the entire organization. They also utilized financial investigations to trace money flows and identify trafficking operations, despite the absence of traditional organizational hierarchies. These confrontations represented a transformation in organized crime structure away from traditional cartel models toward models that emphasized organizational flexibility, competitive market positioning, and distributed decision-making authority. The Hells Angels succeeded not because they were inherently more violent than cartels. They weren't. They succeeded because they organized violence around market objectives rather than simply employing violence to suppress competition. They also succeeded because they understood that sustainable criminal enterprises required community acceptance, relationship management with law enforcement, and economic models that generated sufficient value to incentivize participant loyalty. Cartels relied on fear and coercion to maintain organizational cohesion. Motorcycle clubs relied on ideology, brotherhood, and financial opportunity. These different motivational structures created organizations with fundamentally different operational capabilities and resilience characteristics. The confrontations between the Hells Angels and international drug cartels represent a fascinating case study in organizational competition within criminal marketplaces. They demonstrate that size and financial resources don't necessarily translate to operational dominance when confronting organizations that possess superior structural flexibility and market understanding. The Hells Angels captured vast territory and operational capability from established cartels not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through systematic, methodical displacement across multiple theaters over 2 decades. They did this while operating within law enforcement environments that were simultaneously attempting to disrupt their activities and sometimes accommodating their presence through negotiated relationships and corruption. The result was organizational transformation in the criminal underworld. Cartels adapted to accommodate motorcycle club operational authority. Motorcycle clubs expanded international presence and established themselves as significant trafficking organizations, operating at scales previously dominated by traditional cartels. The criminal marketplace evolved toward competitive plurality rather than monopolistic dominance. This transformation continues today as new organizations emerge and existing structures adapt to maintain operational relevance. What remains constant is the fundamental reality that organized crime represents the application of organizational principles and market mechanics to illegal activities. The organizations most effective at these applications, regardless of whether they wear patches or cartel logos, capture market share and establish operational dominance. The Hells Angels' success against established cartels represents the triumph of organizational discipline and strategic flexibility over raw scale and traditional authority.